Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Those present here, Vaclav Havel Library in Prague, and all those who can communicate with us thanks to technical miracle that is available in our times, and Havel Channel, that is our major partner here in this project. We are going to open a debate on a topic that, in my view, is very important in our current discussions, somewhat turbulent times. The concept that has long history in the 20th century, but that in many, many ways is present with us still today. The topic is totalitarianism, the form of government that managed to kill millions of people in the 20th century, and that still represents a dangerous alternative for those who believe in open society, democracy, and it is important to find a way how to respond properly to such a challenge. This project actually has started already on Thursday. It started in Terezín, and I have here, sitting next to me, Dr. Jan Roubínek, director of Terezín Memorial.
Good evening.
He will participate in the first part of this discussion. And very importantly, I have here Jiří Sozánský and Ivan Vukovský. Jiří, can you please come up and sit here, because maybe I will raise a couple of questions. Because the whole thing started with an art project initiated by this man, artist, sculptor and painter, and his colleagues, that tried to use the horrifying space in Terezín, the fourth courtyard where the detention prison was of Gestapo during the Second World War. And this place was attached to Jewish ghetto, so all these horrors of the 1940s were there, and somewhat present even later in the 1980, when Jiří Sozánský and his group wanted to have a quite significant and visible art project in which a couple of artists participated. And this project was in direct confrontation, if I can say so, with the existing totalitarian regime in Czechoslovakia in these times. It was a different shape of it. It was not a Nazi dictatorship with the intention to find a final solution of Jewish question and all other horrific things. It was the times of normalization. The regime, all the generation here knows pretty well, and they tried to use this space to send their message out in 1980, and they got into a confrontation with the regime, because certainly the regime was not friendly with projects like that. So we have this context, but we are not only followed by virtual audience here, but also on the other side of Atlantic Ocean, because we want to start it as an international communication, international cooperation. So in this moment, I would like to welcome my good colleague from Florida International University, Oren Stier. He will participate in discussion and will give us his impressions. And we want to enlarge this discussion in the second part of our 2 hours session, just to put it into international context in to a larger scheme of things. I also have to welcome, and I'm very happy that he's here with us. Also, I see him on the screen, Professor Holý from Charles University in Prague.
I am only online, but it's a pleasure for me to.
Okay, great. So we will have the communication between institutions, Charles University in Prague, Florida International University, and others who want to contribute to this discussion. And because we would like to map the whole process as effectively as possible. We are very happy that we are supported by the Foreign Ministry of the Czech Republic, so we will hear from Dr. Řehák later, who is now with the minister somewhere in Sweden, but with his contribution. And we will have here later the representative director of Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation entity based in Washington, D.C., seeing things from American perspective. So I see now my good friend Christian Olney on the screen, but Ambassador Bramberg will join us later for this discussion. And we have here Mr. Ondřej Matějka, Deputy Director of Institute for Study of Totalitarian Regimes, a Czech institution financed by the state budget that is in charge of studies of totalitarian regimes, so we'll hear from him. I already mentioned that there are very important people here in the audience, Jiří Sozanský and his colleague Ivan Bukovský, but we have here a significant partner, because right now we finished a conference in Prague, participating Forum 2000. So I see Santiago Alpizar, who is here with us, who can eventually enter into our discussion with a contribution from Cuban perspective, because totalitarianism is not a matter of the past. It's still flourishing in some countries, and Cuba is one of them. So part of our project is to increase the attention, be more punctual and clear what we are talking about, and to find strategies how to overcome the current dictators who would like to, like Dr. Husák in 1980, to keep the status quo untouched and keep their own population, their own peoples in slavery. So we have so many things to do. We would like to start from the exhibition that is still can be seen in Terezín. Also, it can be followed on the screen, I believe, because now in the current days, the technique enables us to streamline things to the world, so it is out there. But first, I would like to ask Dr. Robinek if he can give us his impression with the state of our project that started on Thursday in Terezín. Dr. Robinek.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be with you tonight or this evening. Thank you for that opportunity. Well, last week it was an excellent example of good cooperation between us as an institution and Mr. Sozanský. We started it cooperation already in late 70s or in 80s when Mr. Sozanský actually attended first time, or we started when he started attending in a Terezín Memorial, and I appreciate, or I always appreciated that effort which he made, especially to present in Terezín Memorial, especially in time when it wasn't so it wasn't on demand. It wasn't, as we say today, sexy to present in institution as a Terezín Memorial. And I can imagine how difficult it was then to present his art and to fight communist apparatchiks in early 80s, to be able to show what his work is about. And I saw many artists trying to show the human being or man in his physical and mental hardship. But I would say that Jiří Sozanský is only one, or one of very few, who actually presented continuously since I know him till today. And his main subject is show the man in critical periods of time, in time of the suffering. And what we actually, our project we started last week, or we presented last week, to be precise, is just continuation of what we did, or actually not myself, my predecessor, Mr. Munk, previous director of Terezin Memorial, and it already started with his predecessor, Mr. Novák, byl pan Novák, že jo? In communist time, the directors who understood Mr. Sozansky as a symbol of a fight against the dictatorship. So thank you very much for that opportunity, and I look forward very much in general.
Look, in this moment, I think that we are focused on the way how art can help to send certain messages out and increase our capacity of understanding of certain situations so that we can act. I will first ask Jiří, and then I'm looking forward to engage our partners from both Charles University and Florida University's conversation. But first, Jiří, what I found very important in your activity is that it is a collective project. Artists are known that they are very often close to their workshops, working, interjecting their ideas to material they work with. In this project, it was fascinating that you got certain conflict with communist regime, but the first people who were on your side were former victims, people who experienced totalitarianism in their own situation, who were detained in Terezin, or people who made their own experience with totalitarianism. Já se ptám, jestli nám můžeš něco říct o tom, že pracuješ kolektivně, že umělci to dělají sami ve své izolaci, ve své laboratoři, ve své dílně, ale to, co si udělal, je kolektivní projekt a navíc vytvořil si společenství lidí a tvými důležitými partnery byli ti bývalí vězňové z Terezína. Tak
to je pravda, ano.
Pár slov.
Já myslím, že to byl projekt, který se zúčastnilo víc lidí, byl to projekt dvougenerační dokonce, tak vlastně vyplynulo pomalu ze situace, protože mým prvním partnerem ke spolupráci byl od roku 1977 Ivan Bukovský, jehož oba dva rodiče byli v nacistických lágrech.
Very important. Jiří agrees with me that this collective aspect is extremely important, and he mentioned that Mr. Bukovsky, who is sitting here with us, his both parents perished in Nazi. Not perished, but were detained there. They had their own experience with that. So it was a project of two generations. It is a project in which people with different perspective, with different situation in their life can talk together, work together, and use their own means of communication. In the case of artists, they do what they do. Writers do something else. Writers write books. And we, in your exhibition, saw a great combination of texts and pieces of art. In that respect, I would like to turn it to Oren, who was certainly observing us very closely from the other side of Atlantic Ocean, from Florida International University. He runs their program for Holocaust and Jewish Studies. I am director of Vaclav program for Human Rights and Diplomacy, but we have a different perspectives, but trying to work together. And this is our common effort to start some sort of transatlantic cooperation between Czech institutions and US institutions. So, Oren, give me your first impression. What did you see on Thursday in Terezin, and how it can be conveyed to your students?
So thank you, Martin, very much. And thank you, everyone, for inviting me to join this discussion and for all the different institutions and NGOs, partners that made it happen. I think I'm going to defer the educational question for a moment. I want to respond first of all, just to the question of art in the space and the whole question of art as a tool. And maybe I can use that as an opportunity to get into the issue of education. Because I think Mr. Sosansky mentioned something very important in response to your question about the relationship between the individual artist and the collective, which in many ways also reflects the tension between the individual and society. And I think when we put that in the context of the site-specific art at the Terracin Memorial, what we get is a very powerful interrogation of the space as a space of incarceration, as a space of punishment, of torture, of extremity, and also of the space as it changed and evolved over time under different kinds of regimes. And so when we have the situation of that, the art in the specific spatial context in which it was presented, we have a powerful opportunity to reflect on the nature of time as it passes and the nature of the relationship between the individual and society. And what moved me so much about the art in its presentation was the use of the individual components, the solitary cells, the wider spaces, and then eventually the dance performance out in the courtyard, which gives this remarkable sense of perspective on all the different kinds of characteristics of the space that is there, that was there then during the Holocaust, that was there during the communist regime, and that is there today. And so I found a very powerful tool for engaging people with the nature of that history in its spatial context. And I guess that's the educational opportunity, right? I mean, how do we bring students and really anyone who wants to learn about the past, how do we bring them into an engagement with this? The art helps. And then the technology, of course, helps a great deal because we can't all be there in real space. And so the opportunity, like as I had to beam in, as it were, virtually, and to take advantage of the technological connection is something I think we can use for educational purposes. Certainly the recording also can be something that is used. But I say that also as a word of caution, because in my opinion, nothing is as good as actually being in the space. And so maybe we'll talk about that a little bit some more. But that's some of my initial reactions.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Professor Holly. Professor Holly is fully involved in the area of literature. Actually, he's the author of a very comprehensive and great book on Jewish literature in the 20th century in Czechoslovakia and Czech Republic now. He has tremendous experience with his students and with the state of debate on totalitarianism and Jewish experience during the 20th century. And so we hope that we will initiate or start some initiative bringing us together and start transatlantic dialogue. So please, Professor Holly, how do you perceive the situation now and the project we are starting?
Yes, thank you very much for your words. I am pleased to meet here. Unfortunately, I haven't seen the exhibition Terezin, but I know the works of Jiří Sosansky very good, of course, and admire it. And it was an opportunity to print his work in our collective teamwork, 5 years ago, and also to print his collage in our last book, handbook, maybe it will be handbook of Polish, Czech and Slovak Holocaust literature, text and context. Thank you very much, Mr. Sosansky, for this opportunity. I would say it is very original. Many works in the Holocaust art only reproduce these terrible situations, but it is something original, and it is broader. I think it's a work that is very impressed today too, and this is a question of connections of the Holocaust with the totalitarianism. I have heard Jan Stieber's comments on the exhibition in Terezín, and they were very, very strong, very impressive, in my opinions. And I would say in Czech literature, focus it on the topic Holocaust, we can find really similar demonstrations of these general situations. I think the main work of this area is Jiří Weil's Život s hvězdou, Life is a Star, and this it was printed in 1949, but very strong criticized by the communist ideology critic, and it demonstrates a formless mass of Prague Jews during the Nazi occupations, or a flock of humans being deprived of their human dignity. It's not only a demonstration of horrible Nazi crimes. It is also an image of the generation of so-called normal life. Its absurdity lay in that its victims accepted this fate. One of the most important, for instance, one of the most important scenes in the novel describes an Aryan wife who forced her Jewish husband, Mr. Robicek, to commit suicide, thereby making the situation easier for her and her daughter, and he chose to accept her argument. There are two characters, Robicek, the main character and narrator, and Robicek. Maybe they are doppelganger, dvojníci, and it's interesting. Robicek is also a favorite name in Czech Jewish anecdotes, and so Robicek and Robicek are tragicomic characters, and it is something I would say typical Czech tradition, maybe connected with Hašek and his Švejk, and it was very. This book influenced very strong on Czech literature and Czech film in the 1960s. This is one example of Czech Jewish literature, which is very actual, I think.
And let me to start the second round of our conversation, just to recognize the fact that we are Vaclav Havel Library and that we owe Havel channel as a main communication tool here. So the question is where Václav Havel and his thoughts and his legacy comes here into this debate. Actually, this question has been answered by Jiří Sozanský himself, because to my pleasant surprise, he used quite a lot of Havel's texts to put on his art objects. So there was a combination of words and images, so art objects just put together. I will remind you one most important Havel thing, and this is obviously in this case connected with theater. He's talking about the social power of theater to bring people together, to create some sort of atmosphere, even in the middle of totalitarian enslavement, that people create a community that might have some political potential, as it turned out later. So tell me, Dr. Robinek, have you had the sense of this community and creation when we gather together, exposed to these horrible spaces, but knowing the history of Jiří Sozanský and his exhibition, because it was really beginning when so-called parallel polis, this independent space in which all sorts of activities, Charter 77 from one side to many independent artists found their place. I think that this space does exist till today, should be cultivated, and must have also international dimension. That's why we are trying to open a communication between us here in the Czech Republic, other countries in Europe, in the United States, but Chinese presence in Terezin made a clear statement that it is now a global problem. It's not just a European civilization with its horrible varieties of communism and Nazism, but we see something today connected with other civilizations, other cultural traditions. So, Dr. Robinek, what is the place of Terezin in it? Because you have a specific point of departure, specific experience, but the message goes out to all others. And we are trying to create a community.
Sorry, your question a little bit disappeared. It was too long. So can you be
just question? No, I'm
short and sweet.
Too long. The public space and those this situation in which we who come from different perspectives can do something together. And the place of Terezin as a certain specific situation in communication with other players, alternative to, I would say, thoughtlessness, that is a biggest danger connected with totalitarianism.
Well, our space now in public, dialogue in general is, Terezin Memorial is very important part of, or Terezin in general, very important part of our modern history. And because of the fact that majority of victims of Czech citizens were part of the Holocaust Nazi project, these people were very well known before the war as a Czechoslovak citizens. In understanding of majority, I would say most of Czechoslovaks, the victims and survivors of Holocaust were integral part of Czechoslovak society. You cannot say the same, for instance, in Baltic states or in Poland. And it is actually important factor because Terezin became immediately after the war important part of our modern history. Do not forget that when Terezin Memorial, actually before Terezin Memorial was created in 1947, in so-called national funeral attended politicians like Jan Masaryk or Milada Horáková, people who were killed or by the executed by communist regime. So I'm sure that the idea was a genuine and in order to commemorate victims of the racial and political persecution. During the communist period, it changed a little bit because Terezin Memorial, certain extent, tried to advocate the communist regime and try to show the victims and persecuted people of communists, and it was actually used. The institution was used for the purpose of communist regime, and since the 90s, it all changed, and new leaders they try to balance before the political persecution and persecution of racial persecution of Jewish minority, and here we are, 30 years after Velvet Revolution, more than 30 years actually, and we are trying exactly what politicians like Jan Masaryk and Milada Horáková wanted in 1945, to balance between the racial and political persecution, and definitely not to serve anyone, not any regime, not communist, and not any other, and to be independent as much as we can, even we are funded by the government.
Okay, I will go now to Oren, but before that, quick note. There was an illusion that there is a difference between Nazism and communism, that maybe communism is an unfortunate use of generally good ideas, and Nazism is evil from its very beginning. It turned out that these two forms of government were two variants of one and the same species. Totalitarianism is a generic term, and we can see some differences, but strong similarities always come into mind when you observe the practice of these regimes. Oren, to you. I have already asked you, students, younger generation, it's very important that we are having this conversation across the Atlantic Ocean. Certainly I can imagine that Jewish tradition, seen from your perspective in the United States, it's very similar, they're the same common denominator, but the fact that the United States was not exposed to Nazism and communism speaks for itself. Do you find it difficult and challenging to share this historical experience we in Central Europe have here, all generations, with your students and people who come from their own contexts? How do you see it?
Martin, thank you for the question. So I will get to it. I'm going to use the prerogative of having the floor just to respond to two things that came up in the course. Just firstly, to my colleague, Professor Holly, I'm so thrilled to be able to meet you and talk to you and have this dialogue. And the first thing you mention is a book that I've actually read and actually use in presentations, Life with the Star. So I just wanted to respond to that I found it very relevant in terms of the, I think from our perspective, and this in a way, Martin, responds a little bit to your question, from the US, where students know so little of Eastern Central European culture, literature, tradition, history, geography, anything, really anything. It's important to have these anchors. It's important to have something that can provide the grist for the mill for some kind of common dialogue. And Life with a Star, I think, is an amazingly approachable book. And what you didn't mention, which I find so interesting in Life with a Star, is the what I see as Kafka in the background, and the absurdity of the clerical error that allows the protagonist to be living at all, because through a clerical error he was not deported. So I just so thrilled to have you mention that, and I hope we can continue the dialogue at some point. The other thing I wanted to respond to, Martin, specifically what you just said. Yes, we can look at the historical phenomena of Nazism and communism under the umbrella of totalitarianism. But at the same time, particularly as a professor of Holocaust and Jewish studies, I always want to remind audience, colleagues, students of what we can maybe call the genocidal distinction. That isn't to say that communist regimes also have not dabbled in genocide, but the genocidal aspect of the Nazi era in Europe, I think, is an important one to stress, and to invite a comparative dialogue. And I think that's where my response to your question can come in. From over here, as you well know, in the US, without this historical experience, without having gone through Nazi occupation, communist occupation, any of these kinds of totalitarian regimes ourselves, it's very, very difficult to get students to try to figure out how to relate. And that's why it's always important to find points of entry where American students, with their at times lack of historical knowledge and context, to give them the opportunity to plug into a narrative in order to find themselves in it. It's very, very important in the context of education that students find some kind of relevance, some kind of relatability. And if we can find these moments, they might be artistic interventions, they might be literary interventions. They're surely not just telling history. I don't think American students are going to respond to that very well. So finding those moments, those points of entry, and finding ways for students to somehow relate to them, I think are critical in order to educate the next generation about a history that I'm starting to see my students will start saying, well, this was almost 100 years ago. I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling for those of us who engage in this so regularly and have devoted our careers to it to think about. But time is passing, and it's not so ridiculous for a student to say it's almost 100 years ago. And that just seems like ancient history. So we need to find those points in order to allow them to plug in. Thank you
very much. And Professor Horry would like to comment on that and eventually give us the perspective of your students. I understand that all Czech students are looking at the United States as an important partner institutionally and in all sorts of ways. Do you agree with Professor Stier, or Czech students have it differently?
Yes, in principle, yes. I would say so the memory of the Holocaust transforms in last decades. For many decades in Czechoslovakia, this memory had to compete with the memory with the ethnocentric Czech historical narrative, where the racist politics of Nazis was identified with Germanization, Czech as victims, and so, and later with the communist narrative, with Stalinist anti-Semitism, and in last decades, of course, this memory transforms, and in the Czech Republic, like in the United States and others, Holocaust became a global icon in European American civilization, as in humanity in general. And on the other hand, this universalization was criticized. That for many researchers, the Shoah Holocaust loses singularity, and several American researchers wrote about the Americanization or even trivialization of the Shoah in films like Schindler's List, and so. But if the Holocaust becomes a part of popular culture, even entertainment, on the other side, it can be interesting for young people, the using of new genres and topics can open this topic for younger people. I think it can be a challenge for new artistic expressions. Using of mass and popular culture. In Czech literature is a good example Joachim Topol and his novels. In Polish literature, it can be Igor Ostachowicz, Noc živých Židů, Night of the Living Jews. And these novels use new narrative techniques, irony, grotesque comedy, unpoetic style, fairy tale, fantasy, comics. And I know that for many young people in Prague, for instance, in Prosek, Přírodní gymnázium, it is the topic of young Theresian artists very interesting. They edited Hanuš Hachenburg poems from Theresienstadt or Peter Gintz poems. They were teenagers that perished in Auschwitz, and for many young students, it's interesting the expression of their situation in that time, I think.
Very much. I'm following the time. Do you have any reactions or questions from our audiences, both virtual or those people who are here? Any reaction, any comment, anything anyone would like to ask here? I don't see anyone, so maybe you want to make a last round now. And again, there's one thing we haven't mentioned yet. It's international context. Obviously, Jewish experience has been turned into the existence of State of Israel, and State of Israel is maybe main guardian through Yad Vashem Museum of certain memories. And this international context should not be overplayed, but it is important as well, because I hope and I guess that these experiences we are trying to articulate and to keep in our memories are basis of conversation that should have some I would say, political significance, and especially when it comes to young generation. We always have individual stories and historical narratives, individual memory and collective memories, the way how these memories can be kept together in conversation. Final thoughts in this round. I think that we have generated questions more than answers, and it will be certainly reason for the continuation of this conversation. So, Dr. Robinek, what are the plans of Terezín Memorial in the context of the project we have just started? I guess that it can bring to Terezín attention that is slightly different from traditional tourists coming there, seeing the site, and then going back unchanged.
Well, absolutely. I mean, just to give you just one figure, we have about 300,000 visitors annually. And I wouldn't say that most of them know very well history of Holocaust on European territory. And what we are trying to do, especially, I mean, in general, our narrative, the way we explain the history of Czech Jewry and the Holocaust on our territory was that we actually ended our history by liberation in 1945. And I saw it, for instance, in Cincinnati, in museum, that the American story, as an example, it continues, because the Jewish lives continued after the war as well. And the Jewish communities of United States or in Western world in general, they are integral living part of democratic societies. So what we have to do, we have to open ourselves a little bit more to the world and see that, it was example one we actually, our common project with Mrs. Lau, to show example of segregation of minority in China, for instance. So what I wanted to say, we have to be prepared within these 300,000 visitors we host annually, and I hope there will be more, to accommodate, to be able to show a little bit more general message, because there are more and more examples in contemporary world which of segregation and genocides, which we may help to make it more visible. Well, so that's the message, to see what's actually what's going on in the world, especially in Western world.
Our message is this is a space for effective international cooperation.
Absolutely.
We'll hear at the beginning of the next hour from the representative of the Czech Foreign Ministry. But now, Oren, your final comments. What is the potential of our endeavor?
Oh, well, I mean, I think, to get back to some of the things I said earlier, the exhibition with which we started, I said that it raised the interesting question of the tension between the individual and the collective, the individual and society, which I think is an ongoing concern. And I think we can connect this to some other dichotomies. The physical space versus the virtual space, the opportunities and advantages, the opportunities we have today using technology, just like we're doing right now, to be able to virtually visit a physical space and to interact with it. And I think more and more we're going to see museums and other cultural institutions find ways to invite that kind of a global audience. Never forgetting that the site itself remains important and significant, but to bring more people into its orbit, into some association with it, I think is very powerful and very important. I want to raise another issue, which is the dichotomy or the tension between truth and deception, which I think is something that we can find has a history in Theresienstadt, and I think could be brought out to really productive and provocative ends. Theresienstadt, of course, is famous as the site for one of the biggest Nazi hoaxes or Nazi deceptions played on the International Red Cross. And I think that whole tension and art is something that can help illuminate that and can help expose that. And when we look at the situation in the world today and the whole issue of alternative facts and the extreme relativism of people's perspective, I know from the American perspective, it's very strong here. What is history? What is real? What is true? I would love to hear from my European colleagues what it looks like over there. But so I think this is something that can be really played out at the site, that this is a particular location that among the many sites in the Holocaust landscape speaks specifically to this issue of truth versus deception. And that could be used productively in some future collaborations. And then finally, I just want to get to Martin's point. I beg to differ. I have nothing against Yad Vashem, but I do not see Yad Vashem and Israel as politically important and as supportive as I am of them as the guardians of Jewish memory or of Holocaust memory. I mean, Holocaust memory and the Jewish experience are transnational phenomena. And we're performing that right now in the context of this dialogue. We're actually actualizing the possibility that talking about the Holocaust doesn't have just a broad historical context or broad political context, but it also has a broad transnational context. And this is not just because the victims came from everywhere, were deported to various places, and then if they survived, ended up in various places. It's because the very fabric of the Jewish experience and of Holocaust memory is built on transnationalism. So I don't think any one place is the guardian, but rather that we're all collectively the guardians of memory.
Thank you very much. Professor Holly, your final brief comments?
Yes. So as Oren said, the show is something transnational. But as far as Czech literature, we try to research also specific Czech or Polish or Slovak or Central European traditions. And here is very, very interesting to compare these traditions and these topics and motifs and characters in various literature. So, for instance, there is a character of a little Czech or Slovak man in a Czech literature. I mentioned Jiří Weil, but also Josef Škvorecký, the Menora, Bělohradská, Without Beauty, Without a Color, or Ladislav Fuchs and Grossman and his famous filmed novel, The Shop on Main Street. Here is very important the question of a responsibility of these seemingly innocent people for the persecution of the Jews. So it is something what is I think what is asked in another way in Polish and or in Slovak literature, that we know that in Poland or Slovakia there were pogroms during and after the war, in Czech not, but for Czech people was the indifference to Jewish people very characteristic. And maybe another Another question is also the Roma community in the Czech lands and the persecutions of Roma, the so-called Paraimos, Holocaust of the Roms, and the responsibility of Czech people for it. That all these discussions about so-called gypsy camps in Lety, in South Bohemia, or Odonín in South Moravia, that for decades that was not a part of Czech historical concessions or Czech historical memory, that were Czech gendarmes who detained the Roma and transported them to these camps. And there's a problem that Roma people haven't literary tradition. They are mostly oral tradition, but I think it is possible to evoke also these questions.
We are getting to the end of this first part of our seminar. I would like to go back in my final statement to thank once more Jiří Sozanský and Ivan Bukovský and their colleagues, because I think that they helped us to start something important for the future, to start from the past, but look towards the future. There will be one question I would like to ask Professor Holý. Is a problem of translation of literature from Czech, Polish, Slovak, Roma to other languages to English. Translation is always a tricky thing. But for art, art is somewhat universal in its nature, so it doesn't need to be translated as texts do. So it has a special potential. So Jiří, Dr. Robinek, Oren, Professor Holý, who else? Ivan Bukovský, thank you very much. The first part is over and we are ready to start the second one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Takže jo, pojďte tam Matějka, teď vás vystřídá. Dobře, takže pak si spojíme, jo? A moc díky moc, děkuju.
Martine.
Okay, so we are starting the second part of our seminar on totalitarianism. In the second part, we will be more focused on, I would say, larger international context and maybe institutions that are involved. But I would like to invite here one special guest, Mr. Santiago Alpizar. He's Cuban, representing by himself Cuban perspective. So please, would you mind to come here and sit here, because it might be a chance to give you a floor. The first apology, Mr. Dr. Řehák from Foreign Ministry cannot be with us because he is with his boss, with Czech Foreign Minister in Sweden at a conference, but he has sent us a message. So please, let's listen to what Mr. Řehák had to say to us.
3 or 4 affairs. I'm sorry I can't be with you as a special envoy for Holocaust Interfaith Dialogue and Freedom of Religion. I represent right now my country at the Malmö International Forum on Holocaust, Remembrance and Combating Anti-Semitism in Sweden, where we were invited with our Minister of Foreign Affairs by the King Carl. I would like to thank to all organizers and participants of this important seminar on totalitarian regimes like Nazism and Communism on the topic how to pass the experience to the future generations. My sincere thanks go to FIU, Ambassador Martin Palous, Terezín Memorial, Vaclav Havel Library, and to you all participants. Please let me start with my personal story. Before the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, I studied veterinary high school in then very communist city Hradec Králové, eastern from Prague. Already then I was interested in religion. One evening I went to a lecture on Jewish legacy. The next morning I came to my school, and in front of the school were 2 police cars, communist police cars. I asked myself, someone was killed here when 2 cars had to arrive? To my surprise, no. They came for me to investigate my interest in religion. After their discussions with the teacher, they wanted to kick me out of the school. Fortunately, the Velvet Revolution came and I could finish my studies. This personal experience and later conversations with Holocaust survivors changed me and created a special sensitivity in me to all the events, acts and speeches that could lead to some similar disasters or genocide again. Therefore, I strive for greater engagement of civil society. The legislative and technical measures to prevent authoritarian and totalitarian tendencies are not enough. Especially young people with new, original and fresh ideas can help in the long run if they are well motivated to do so through proper education, including seminars like this one. It would be great if FIU students could take part on an international video contest about the new message of Holocaust today in the frame of the International Ministerial Conference that I prepared as a part of the Czech presidency of the Council of the European Union in the second half of 2022. The conference will be as a follow-up to the Terezín Declaration endorsed by 47 countries. The main goal of the conference will be to support educational and remembrance programs for young people, to review progress in rectifying injustice from the time of the Holocaust, and encourage the creation of strategies and funds for combating anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and hate. Thank you very much for your attention, and see you soon. Thank you.
Dr. Řehák, and now official welcome again to our all partners, especially those on the other side of Atlantic. Ambassador Bremberg, he is now director of our very important partner organization, Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, based in Washington, D.C. I'm happy that Ondřej Matějka, Vice Deputy Director of Institute for Study of Totalitarianism, is here today and already introduced our guest, Santiago Alpizar. First, Ambassador Bremberg, can you make any comments on what you could have seen so far and eventually the ideas coming from your institution? How can we cooperate?
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to virtually join you all today to discuss this important topic. As you mentioned, I recently became the president of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation here in Washington, D.C., after returning to the United States from serving in Geneva. And our organization was chartered by Congress, actually, in 1993, in recognition that with the fall of the Soviet Union, the important work of educating Americans about the victims of communism needed to happen and needed to happen in a very important way. I'll just say at the outset, I really enjoyed part of the previous panel where I got to hear some of the conversation that focused more on, I think, the artistic elements and literature elements in terms of the important role those elements play in transmitting knowledge and teaching generations about communism. And I would just say that's been an incredibly important part of our work, both in terms of the work we do with whether it is dissidents today, that may be art, obviously we know in Cuba, the San Isidro movement today, led by artists. I always point out, these are not individuals that are started off interested in politics or political dissidents. These are artists that by the nature of communism will turn into dissidents. And hopefully that's a theme we can talk about a little later on in terms of the nature of a totalitarian regime, whether it is an artist class, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, intellectuals, by its nature takes on this totalitarian oppressive role in seeking to dominate any way of thinking differently than what is the directed party ideology. But just to provide context for our organization before we go into these great topics, as I mentioned, we've been around for almost 25 years. And unfortunately, I'd say broadly in the United States, and I know this was talked about in the last panel, have not been as successful as we would like in educating Americans about the history and victims of communism. It was great to hear from the previous panel and from, I think, Dr. Steer and others about, I think, the great pride we should take in how successful we have been. I mean, we can always still improve, but how successful we have been in educating now multiple generations of Americans about the victims of the Holocaust, but unfortunately have done nowhere near as well in educating about the many 100 million victims of communism from around the world over the course of almost the last century. So I'm really thankful for the opportunity to join you all today to discuss this vitally important topic, to hear from you about your experience on the other side of the Atlantic. Obviously, I know this is something we'll discuss, how our country's experiences are fundamentally different. From the United States perspective, we are blessed to not have suffered under a Nazi occupation or communist occupation. We have the experience of seeing these evils from afar at first, and then confronting them both through war or through peace through strength. But our land, our people themselves largely did not bear those scars, with the exception of those who immigrated to the United States and brought that experience with us. But that I know in our experience, in trying to teach and educate Americans about this important topic, that is a difficulty. That not just in terms of as talked about before, this is now going on 100 years in looking back in history, but also the difference in time and space and a lack of just personal or familial experiences that most Americans do not have is a huge education challenge. So I'm sure we'll have opportunities to talk about some of the more programming that we do. The discussions abound. Personal stories, I think, are incredibly important, and I can talk about some of the work we've done in that space. And I would just say at the outset, We are proud that here in Washington, D.C., we will be opening the International Victims of Communism Memorial Museum here in Washington in early 2022. So thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I just wanted to provide a little intro from our perspective here.
Thank you very much for this statement. What it has reminded me of is the statement or speech made by President Havel, the first one when he addressed the US Congress in February of 1990. He said there's something like that you Americans were fortunate not to be forced to go through the experience we had to make ourselves. Now we'll need a lot from you, but there might be something that we can offer you as a compensation. And what we can offer is our experience with totalitarianism and eventually the knowledge that has come out of it. My question is, have we delivered on this note enough? Certainly we have many reasons to ask this question because there are so many flaws and imperfections, challenges and new problems and new questions. So I have here Ondřej Matějka, Deputy Director of Institute that has been created exactly for this purpose in the Czech Republic. So do you have any comment?
Thank you for inviting us to this conversation. Our institute was, as Mr. Palouš has said, founded in order to reflect on the Czech experience with the dictatorship in the 20th century, both with the Nazi occupation and the communist dictatorship. And the challenges they are discussed here are actually our challenges, because it's more and more difficult to translate the experience with the dictatorship for the present day society in the Czech Republic. Of course, there's a still difference between the US and the Czech society. Here the experience is much more present. Even in the pop culture, we have films about communist and about communist era and from the World War II. But still, the message which we could take out from these dictatorships is difficult to translate. Short example: since the last weekend election, finally, after exactly 100 years. We do not have Communist Party in our parliament. It's actually a great day, but it makes the challenge only visible we have so long, because the communists are gone from the parliament, but it doesn't mean that the threats of the totalitarianism and the threats for our freedom are away. They are still here, and we have to translate it. I think it's if I could say some examples, we see the threats for our freedom today, that we still have political parties which exclude some groups of the society from the main society. Even if they are poor, or if they are Roma people, or foreigners or migrants, we still have political parties. They do operate with this idea, excluding somebody from the good society, from the common society, which is a principle which is always dangerous for freedom, and we still do have it here, and we can learn from our history that it leads finally to dictatorship if we follow these principles, or if we do not take seriously our parliament enough. We do have politicians who still say that parliament is only a place where the people only discuss and they do nothing. Actually, it's very strongly represented, this opinion. Again, it's very dangerous, because after the war, exactly when the republic was reformed, then the communists took this idea, and they were very successful with that by criticizing the parliament. And criticizing the parliament today is again very dangerous. Translating these lessons from our history to the present day Czech society and making them more aware of the risks for our present day freedom and future freedom is a challenge. It's not that easy, because we are much more used to be focused only on the history, and you know, in the historical science especially, you are very much focused on the history itself. But we have to find ways how to translate. It's our deal. It's not easy. I wouldn't say that we are really successful in that, but it's our mission.
Thank you very much. I think that the institutional cooperation between U.S. institution that is in charge of memory of victims of communism and our institution here is must, and we will talk about that. But I've registered Tomáš Kraus coming here. So please, would you like to join us here? Tomáš Kraus is executive secretary of Federation of Jewish Communities in the Czech Republic. So he also might be willing to participate in this conversation. But I will use the presence of Santiago Alpizar, who is Cuban, because actually it goes exactly to the heart of the matter. We work a lot with Czech organization called Postbellum, which in the name indicates postbellum, after war, that we are talking about the past. But Cubans are always reminding us that it's not postbellum but in bello, that it's part of the present and future-oriented situation. So Santiago, welcome here and your comments.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, everyone, for having me today. I would like to refer to the first part of this conference, where arts here in the Czech Republic was a mean to overpass censorship, and exactly happening now in Cuba by the government imputing the artist a political opinion. For that reason, now the narrative in Cuba has changed from the revolutionary slogan of fatherland or death, which is Patria o Muerte, which is the slogan of Fidel Castro, to Patria y Vida, which means fatherland and life. That's exactly what we looking for in Cuba, to have a life, because the Communist Party has become the biggest and most furious enemy of the Cuban people, practicing apartheid. And how is similar the apartheid from South Africa to the situation in Cuba? Well, the Communist Party is only 4% of the population of Cuba, and they are apartheiding Cuba from electoral law. They cannot participate freely in elections. They cannot participate freely in cultural matters, in education, only with the control of the Communist Party. That was what we call ideological apartheid suffering in Cuba. I would like to recognize the Foundation of Crimes Against Communists, the recent law passed in Florida. I'm a Floridian as well, that is mandatory now for the Floridian student to pass a course in how communism is, or what communism means, in order to acquire a grade in secondary level of education. That one is a very important. And giving back to Cuba, what I would like to you to understand that Cuba is a place where crimes against humanity are practicing every day. Crimes against humanity doesn't mean you are to kill somebody because of race or because of religion or anything. Crimes against humanity specifically entitles those crimes committed to the context of the large-scale attack targeting civilians, regardless of their nationality. These crimes include murder, which is present in Cuba, torture, sexual violence, enslavement, and the case in Cuba case is clear what happened with the doctor working abroad, which had declared recently that being modern case of enslavement, persecution, and everybody knows that Cubans are persecuted everywhere they go. Even here, maybe I've been persecuted by one of the agents of the security of the state because I am speaking you freely of what happened in Cuba. Enforced disappearance has recently happened with the people who participate in the Journal of Protest in Cuba on July 11th. What I'm looking for is the support of the international community, and I'm glad Martin bring me here, because we are looking for partners to visualize what happened in Cuba, to seek an totally encyclical, diplomatically and commercially to end the communists in Cuba.
Thank you very much, Tomáš. Actually, interesting enough, and correct me if I'm wrong, we met for the first time in Washington, didn't we? I think
we
so.
met before, but then in Washington.
No. What I mean is, it's not important. Yeah. What is important is that there is a federation of Jewish communities here in Czech Republic, but they are international entities such as Ben Hybrid or American Jewish Community, all those who are helping us to magnify a certain messaging we are trying to formulate and generate. So any comment,
yes,
advice how we can improve our operation?
Yes, actually, as you said, the Federation and many other friends around us, that means not only institutions but also individuals, in our case actually are focusing to the past. We are not in the same situation today as you are, because you are fighting a daily life, you know, what comes every day to you. Fortunately enough, and we can comment our political situation in this country for maybe weeks, but there is a certain development now. Anyway, but what we are doing is that we are focusing on the past in order to carry on something what our parents and grandparents had on their mind when they survived. Only a bunch of people survived, as you all know, and their mantra, their main message was never again, never again. Of course, we are repeating it like Edgar Allan Poe, yes, but at the same time it became almost empty. You know, never again, you can imagine under this whatever you want. What we are doing, we are trying now to find a modern language to present what happened. And by the way, we are now in mid of October, and we are commemorating the 80th anniversary of the first transports of Czech Jews to, first it was the two transports to concentration camp of Palouš, and then followed, which we will be commemorating in November 24, which is the very first transport to this infamous place called Theresienstadt Terezín, and I have a personal feeling to this because my father was among those who were in the very first transport to Terezín, together with the father of the not far away here sitting Ivan Bukovsky. They were together in the same transport, and now we together are actually binding on their legacy, and we have been able to publish a book which was written by my father, and Ivan is illustrating the book. That we have now a second volume of these memoirs. But why we are doing this? This is not only to recreate the world of what was yesterday, but it's a memento. Because it can happen today, as we all know. As we look around, fortunately enough, not in our country so far, but if we look around in the world, so we can see that the same models which actually brought our parents and grandparents to this terrible, tragic situation are repeating themselves. And you are just astonished when you see what is happening. I'm sorry to say this, I'm repeating myself, I said that several times, in Afghanistan. Look at, this is exactly the same what has happened here in this country in 1938, when all our allies have abandoned us, because this was for Mr. Chamberlain, this was a faraway country. Who cares? And it had the impact on individual lives, not only just we can read it today in textbooks, fine, but it had an impact even on us who are living today. So this is my small comment.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Bremberg, I think that now we are generating a lot of reasons why we should strengthen or institutionalize our cooperation. Do you have any ideas, concrete suggestions? I'm told that your institute is planning soon a visit to our part of the world, or eventually to Prague, so I can commit myself here loud and clear that I'm ready to help you to have your effective communications here. And certainly Institute for Study of Totalitarian Regimes is one of your natural partners. So what are your plans?
Thank you. And yes, we are hopefully planning a visit to Central Europe soon. I wanted to just follow up on a point that Santiago made. He referenced, and for your audience that may or may not be familiar, so in the United States, education is primarily governed by states. That they're the primary funders and administrators of our education system. And we worked with the state of Florida just this past year that became the first state in the country to mandate that as part of their higher education program, students learn about communism and totalitarianism as part of their classes. And that's a program that we launched in partnership with the state legislature in Florida and are now working in every other state in the United States to get that adopted across the country. I just wanted to highlight something that Santiago said, because it's actually very important today as a means of educating students. This is the most important place and opportunity we have to reach students and make sure they learn these things. And I just wanted to follow up on a point that I thought of while watching the previous presentation, that in educating students, obviously teaching them about the history is very important. But I think what came through in the previous discussion is that really it's through art and culture and literature that people really learn and understand these dynamics and understand, in a more deep way what has actually happened in the past. And I think learning from as I said before, the success we've had in educating generations of Americans about the victims of the Holocaust, really, I've never met an American that has not read The Diary of Anne Frank. And that the experience, a shared cultural experience of learning through literature as a young child, before you even learn to understand really what's World War II, what's happening in the Holocaust, you have a formative experience of reading an incredibly impactful story, from a child to a child, learning about that harrowing experience, and that shapes the reality of how young Americans therefore learn about the Holocaust in the future, both in school and then also in popular culture, like compelling movies like Schindler's List. I think is really compelling and important. So I want to focus on that for kind of two reasons. So one is, unfortunately, in the United States, we do not read literature of those that have been survivors or victims of communism for the most part. Obviously, when The Day in the Life or Gulag Archipelago came out, that had huge impacts in the United States. But frankly, most students will never read either one of those works by Solzhenitsyn, and most other great literature of telling the stories of people or families from communism is not widely read in the United States. So that I wanted to that's one project my organization is working on right now, to help identify and bring those works into schools so that more students will understand and read that literature at an earlier age. Recognizing that not everyone only reads books, but we look at movies and things, and we want to reach Americans that are already outside of school. We have a growing project that we do called the Witness Project, where we produce short form documentaries of first-person interviews of individuals who themselves are survivors of communism, and record those stories and create small documentary movies that can be used both in popular culture and can be used in schools. So this is, I think, really important work of not just educating about the history of communism and totalitarianism, which is important, but helping people learn what that meant and the reasons for that. Unfortunately, I could go on about why largely in the United States, this has not been transmitted through generations. We have a huge education gap where people younger than I do not know or understand the victims of communism, why communism rose, why it by nature became this horrific, totalitarian, oppressive regime spread around the world, and what we, as young people today and Americans and those freedom-loving people all around the world need to do to stand up to this threat. So this is something that is, very important. I think a transatlantic partnership is vital, particularly, those countries that are formerly communist countries that have that unique experience of both, first, suffering under communism, but then two, freeing themselves from communism is an incredibly powerful and potent story for both Americans to hear, and that's my main focus. But I also believe for the 1 billion people around the world today that still live under communism to hear. I think whether in Cuba or in China, these are very powerful stories and a witness that those in Central and Eastern Europe can give of both, not just the experience and suffering of communism, but the success in overcoming and freeing yourselves from communism. So I think that's an important story that doesn't always get told. And I'm curious from your own perspective, is that one that you find yourself taking pride in and teaching younger generations about, or is that sometimes lost and kind of taken for granted? Because I think it's something that's a very powerful story that needs to be told.
I think that your contribution generates a lot of interesting questions. Just following up to what Tomáš Kraus said, we need to find a way how to use the past to be more effective to understand the future. And here I think is a great topic is the relationship between history as a magistra vitae and personal stories of individuals that have happened in a certain moment of time, and we are dealing with tension between individual and collective memories. Individual memory always can be faulty. You always can get into certain internal stereotypes, and we need to find a way how to correct ourselves, how to confront our story with memory of others. And this can lead to disputes, to conflicts, but also it can generate some sort of reconciliation we all need. We have published a book, our project in Florida, and then Czech translation of it appeared here thanks to our cooperation with Institute for Study of Totalitarian Regimes. The book's name is The Presence of the Past. And these are essays on memory, conflict, and reconciliation. So I think that this is exactly the area where we want to stay. I would like to ask Mr. Matějka, because that's one of the areas certainly we are trying to think about work and cooperation and some future-oriented projects. But this institute has a very specific opportunity. It's connected with archives. And all journalists know how important it is to check your own ideas against archival materials. You can call them primary sources or secondary sources. And archives in the context of former communist regimes have all sorts of strange things to be found there. So how Institute for Study of Totalitarian Regime is using the fact that it's connected with very strong archival databases?
Of course, it's one of the fundament of our institute, as it was created in 2007. There was founded the institute, and at the same time the Archive of Security Services, and in which the files of the communist state security is actually settled there. It's quite vital that these files are open. The issue is that, of course, these are specific files because they were created by actually a criminal organization. State security was spying the people. They were forcing the people in situations where just to collaborate with them. And you have to read these files properly. It's not everything there is written the truth, but it's a very important source of the truth after you reflect these files. Of course, opening these files was very painful for the Czech society, because many inconvenient truths came out from these files. Very often, it's every post-communist country came through that. If the Cubans once they were luckily overcoming their revolutionary phase of their history, it will be the same case. It's not that obvious that every country of post-communist country was willing to open the archives. It actually started in Germany, then it came in Poland. Relatively late, it came in the Czech Republic. But I think it's necessary to go through that, to this painful part. We are now trying to not only to make research with help in these files, but we also try to educate the people about how to understand it, because it's always necessary to understand the situation of the people. They were forced to collaborate, for example, or people they were spied. It's also about the context of these files were created, and it's not that difficult. But the later we are after the revolution, the better understanding we have, actually. Just after the revolution, I think it was 1992, where the list of secret agents of the state security was published. It was really an outrage. Many people were hurt because there were the list of the collaborators, but there were no files accessible. The files were accessible, in fact, some 10-15 years later. If the Cubans want to open the archives, please open it at once, together, not only the lists of the agents, but together with the files. So it's a difficult issue, but it's very important to go through that.
Look, but there is one very interesting moment here, and the moment is that totalitarianism is not a domestic phenomenon only, but it always has a strong international dimension. All these intelligence communities or operations were not only focused on how to keep domestic population in the certain situation under control in fear, but also they were operating internationally. They were part of the global conspiracy of communism against the whole world. And here is a very specific thing which brings us together to Cubans. I recently was asked to write something and run into the story of Che Guevara. And it turned out that Che Guevara spent important time in Prague on the way from Africa, where he failed to disseminate his revolution, before he was on the way to Bolivia, where he ended his diplomatic or revolutionary mission in the way as he did. So Che Guevara was really in Prague, and it was exciting read for me to see his situation here, how he was operating, how he was surrounded by 5 at least different security details, Czechoslovak, Soviet, Cuban, East German, and most likely American too. I don't want to go into detail here, but there is a lot that can be get from archives like in the Czech Republic to understand better not only domestic situation, but these international components. Again, another topic for our conversation. Ambassador Rembrandt, what do you think?
Martina.
Yes, Tomáš, please.
First of all, I have to apologize because I have to leave again, sorry. But binding on what Ondřej was speaking about, we in the Jewish community, we were confronting with this very shortly after the files have been opened. And we found out that actually every Jew in this country was followed by the secret police since the 50s. And even there was a list of Jews, supposedly, which was binding on a very similar list which was done by the Nazi Gestapo. So you can see a clear link between these two totalitarian regimes, because we were naturally enemies of these totalitarian regimes. And there is a clear link that they have been using the same methods and the same resources, actually, which is a lecture, actually.
Sorry, to the list, it was not only from the 50s, but then again in the in the start of the 70s, the same list was done again. Yeah.
And unfortunately, when we had democracy in the 90s, so it was misused by the anti-Semites who have published that in a so-called, if you remember, Martine, it was called Weekly Politica. Remember that?
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
I have to
maybe we should open it up to any other impulses from the audience, virtual or locally present. Do you have any reactions or comments? Anyone wants to say something? Gentleman over there? We can't hear you.
Yeah, I'm a Don Ritter, board of directors of Communism Memorial Foundation for nearly 25 years. And I see in what you guys are doing there just a tremendous intellectual resource and a resource of experience, past experience, and present understanding of the nature of communism and the integration of, for example, your institute and the library and potentially other elements of Czech society. Our museum is a challenge, but it's also a tremendous opportunity. And in the digital world that we live in, the digitization of the essentials of the Institute and what you believe is critical and important make a tremendous contribution to our museum. And so it's not just space, which is going to always be limited, but a program that can be digitally integrated with our programs. And also on the education front, as Andrew was talking about, some of the experiences you're talking about are just, they're dying to be exposed to the American people, frankly. And we have an issue here, and Andrew was mentioning it yesterday evening. We have an issue. The Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation does polling every year through the vaunted Pew institution, and we see a growing affinity for both communism and socialism, to the point where communism and socialism actually has a somewhat slight majority, but a majority over communism when you poll millennials and you poll Generation Z. So it's not as if we're the total bastion here. And one of the reasons why communism never received the kind of attention that the Holocaust received is that there is some, has been some, and potentially has still some affinity here in this country for these, exotic philosophies, never having, and that's part of our responsibility, these exotic philosophies, which people never experience, especially young people who have grown up with everything given to them, and without an ahistorical context. I mean, history is what happened last week at the football game, or so we have a challenge there ourselves.
Ambassador Bremer, can't you comment on it, or is it something what you would say yourself like that?
Well, I was going to comment on just a different point that you had made earlier about the importance of the part of the conversation about opening these files and sharing this information. I think that can be incredibly helpful in educating people, not just in terms of what's happening in their most recent history, but again, it's to the point of making clear the totality and extent. And, we were talking about the surveillance, there's the invasiveness of the regimes in terms of the extent they would go, not just in terms of tracking and monitoring, high profile political dissidents, but the type of invasive surveillance that average citizens are put under in terms of the entire atmosphere of fear and suspicion that these regimes create, that breaks down the kind of fundamental elements of community and society, where you feel, do I trust my neighbor? Should I be afraid that a neighbor, of what I say privately to a friend or a neighbor, that could be, that they'll tell the regime? And I think that's we've seen some instances in art, in film where that's portrayed, but from an American perspective, that is a very hard element to convey without telling it through lived experience and stories or things like film. The level of kind of oppression, not just the brutality of the gulags and the deportations and murders that obviously are horrible and are more shocking to the average listener or being educated, but the truly pervasive nature that of oppression that the state put in place, and how that fundamentally changed communities and how people relate to one another. I think that's an important story, obviously, that needs to be told. And as I said, I think it's actually very difficult for people that have not experienced it to actually understand. I mean, thankfully, as I said, Americans have not experienced this. It's easier to understand and grasp some of the more kind of either graphic or horrific actions that are very specific and public, but the kind of oppression that takes in and oppresses a culture or society is very difficult for Americans, I think, to grasp and understand. So I think that type of explanation through not just publishing of lists, but really, as was talked about before, providing the context of what that meant, I think can be very, very powerful in helping shape people's understanding, that you get a more real understanding of what life was like under a regime.
Look, but a word of warning, and maybe Mr. Magiga would like to follow up. I think that what must be first clear enough is the real purpose of that opening. Should not be sensationalism, should not be too much intrusion to privacy or intimacy of people. Certainly you can use it just to illustrate character of certain public officials so that they are hypocrites and so on and so forth. But I think that what is the real purpose of it? In my view, it is, if I can be allowed to use this metaphor, to have some sort of vaccination against a certain disease. We now talk a lot about vaccines and COVID pandemics, but there are political diseases as well, and I think ideology is the central topic. It's so easy to transform all the truths around ourselves into some sort of ideological concepts. And it can be even a path to hell paved with good intentions sometimes, and then inability to stop the train before it really goes and ends in the abyss. So I think that data and facts are certainly important, but the truth is what we are looking for, and the question is, what is the truth? This question of Pontius Pilate is quite important. It's not just data, facts, objectivity. The truth is something deeper. So I think that this opening must be followed or accompanied by certain deeper philosophical discussion about the problem.
What we can definitely offer to you in terms of possible collaboration and to support your plans in the US is that we can really offer you digitalized files from our archive. We have many millions of pages digitalized already. They are online. They are not that easy online. You have to be registered due to the law, but it's not a problem to share with you the scans. And it's also not a problem to select scans. They are somehow related to the international context, as Martin Palous already mentioned. There are stories connected with Che Guevara, but there are also stories connected to the U.S. citizens. So we are in the archive. We are showing to American students, if they are coming for excursions, files connected to the wife of, or ex-wife of Mr. President Trump, because his first wife was, Ivana Trump was a Czech citizen, and her father, of course, had to collaborate somehow with the state security in order to visit her in the US. It's very much liked by the American students that are coming to Prague. So we can show the way how state security and the dictatorship worked. Of course, we can also offer you international educational materials. We have made an international educational project. It means socialismrealized.eu, and you can find teaching materials dealing with the Czech experience, about general experience with the dictatorship. We can share this, and even again, I fully support the idea of Martin Palous that we should internationalize the debate about totalitarianism, because we have to understand each other. Few examples from our practice from the last time. We have now launched an exhibition about the Ukraine history in the 20th century, because Ukraine is a democratic country, but endangered by the Russian state at the moment. It's very difficult. It's very hard for them to keep their freedom. And in Czech Republic, a huge Ukrainian community is living. So we try to discuss with them about in danger of their freedom. In about a month, we will have here in this library, Vaclav Havel library, a debate with Belarus, with the representatives of the Belarusian opposition. We will invite them here to Prague and have a debate. It's also an attempt how to translate our experience to the other countries and to their present problems, and to, of course, to support them. And we have last week started a debate with our colleagues from Postbellum. She's living in Mexico, and we would like to launch some educational materials about the Cuban issue.
Well, Martin, if you allow me, this is a practical experience, anecdotic, in how we Cubans in exile in the United States have started fighting repressors, communists. It's a project that I've been directing, which is Cuba Repression ID. Cuba Repression ID is a project where people identify repressors that are living now in the United States thanks to the benefit of the immigration law in the United States. And through this project, we have been able to single out several individuals that were criminals in Cuba, acting on behalf of the state security, acting on behalf of the communist regime in Cuba. And we successfully secured a sentencing in one of these individuals, not because the crime that he committed in Cuba, because he lied on his applications for immigration benefits, and because the immigration law in the United States had no statute of limitation, we were able to prosecute this guy for visa fraud, and he was deported from the United States as a consequence of his repressive actions in Cuba.
It's a very good example, but let me to finish, because I see that we are getting close to the end of our session. What Ondřej Matějka said about this special gift we are now preparing for Cubans just for this Christmas season. With Eva Kubátová, she is our person operating from Mexico City. We are putting together a book of 63 stories of Cubans, 63 years of oppression, so 63 stories of Cubans, just presenting their experience, and we will like to have it in form of domino. Domino is most popular game in Cuba, and we would like to generate some sort of domino effect with that. So we are thinking about that. trying to use as creatively as possible our understanding of history and our perceptivity of stories of individuals that need to tell their stories, at least to transform their suffering to some sort of knowledge or maybe catharsis, if you want to use these arguments. So we have many things to do together, Ambassador Bremberg and Mr. Matějka from the Czech institution, to study these horrible things. And I hope that this is not the end. This is the end for now, but it's the beginning of something bigger. So thank you very much, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Martin.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.